Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar within the title Trans Rights Are Human Rights, What Role of Anti-Oppressive Social Work?
This shit fucking recorded.
I'm Dimitra Dorateloni. I'm assistant
Oh,
in the University of West Attica in Greece, and I'm member of the steering committee of Greek Swan and Swan International. As you may know, 20th of November is a Trans Day of Remembrance. It's a day dedicated to the awareness of trans rights, but it's also a day for trans people, for the trans people that have been killed.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Only in 2020.
Hello. I have a question.
Sorry, is someone that's speaking and interrupting? Can we mute them?
I said I have a question.
Only in 2020, 350.
Fuck you.
These murders are hate crimes and are linked with a general rise of racism, of fascism, of homophobia and transphobia. Therefore, we are here today to discuss with some excellent speakers about this general context, about the trans rights, but also to discuss about the role of social workers and social work by a radical perspective and of course by an anti-oppressive perspective. This webinar is run by Swan International, for which Ian Ferguson will tell us some more things. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Dora, and it's great to see so many people here this afternoon from around the world. My name is Ian Ferguson, and I'm one of the founders of the Social Work Action Network in the UK. Swan International has grown out of that network. We now have Swan International groups in 14 or 15 different countries, and we have organised this, I think, very important, very timely webinar this afternoon. Swan International is a network of social work workers and social work action groups around the globe, from Chile to Hong Kong, from Sweden to South Africa. We campaign against the privatization of social work, against the marketization of social work, but also against all aspects of oppression. And we fight for a genuinely anti-oppressive social work. So far we have campaigned for asylum seekers, we have campaigned for the rights of people in Palestine, and we have campaigned in support of Black Lives Matter. So today's webinar is really a logical development of that commitment to challenging oppression and to anti-oppressive practice. As Dora says, I think we have some fantastic speakers this afternoon, and there will also be plenty of time at the end for questions and discussion. So I'll now hand back to Dora to go through the process of today and to introduce our first speaker. Thanks, Dora.
Okay, Ian, thank you. So we're gonna have the speakers. There are 3 speakers. Each one will speak for 10 minutes, please, not more than 10 minutes. And then after they finish, after the final 3rd speaker, you can raise your hands in Zoom and you can ask questions, or alternatively, you can also write in the chat your questions, and we can put the questions back to the speakers. Then each of the speakers will have 5 minutes to respond to the questions and comments. So now I'm gonna pass to Laura Miles. Laura Miles is author of the book published in 2020 with its name as Trans Resistance, Socialism and the Fight for Trans Liberation. She's former college lecturer and LGBT representative on the National Executive Committee of the University and College Union. Laura, thank you very much for being with us today. Please.
Thank you, Dora, and thanks very much for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. As Dora said earlier, we've just had Transgender Day of Remembrance. I don't know how it went elsewhere, but certainly the one I was on in my hometown here of Leeds was probably nearly twice as big as last year's. And that's a reflection, I think, of the prominence that the whole issue of trans and transphobia has risen to in recent times. This webinar is titled "Trans Rights Are Human Rights," and that's both a statement and a claim. It's a statement of reality for those who believe in the rights of the oppressed and for those who want to embed anti-oppressive practice in social work. But it's also a claim that has to be defended against those primarily on the political right, but also some trans-exclusionary feminists and even some on the left who want to deny it, and worse, currently working to undermine the human, legal and social rights that have been won by trans people in many places through organising, through advocacy, through struggle and resistance. I think there are other claims that trans people which flow from the claim of human rights that also need to be asserted and defended. For example, that trans women are women and trans men are men, and non-binary is a valid identity that deserves respect. That people have a right to define, to name their own identity, and for that to be respected. That trans and gender non-conforming people have a right to bodily autonomy. It's not up to states, religious organisations, the medical profession or others to act as gatekeepers. That trans rights don't conflict with or undermine women's rights, particularly as trans women are women and trans men are men. We need to remember that nothing has been won by oppressed people and the working class in general without having to fight for it, whether that's the right to vote, to organise unions against discrimination, for equal pay, and so on. In capitalism, nothing worth having is freely given to working people without struggle from below. Now, in a period of worsening crises around climate change, widening economic inequality, the COVID-19 pandemic with a new variant that appears to be spreading around the world rapidly, and so on, that threaten the very existence of human civilization. Reactionary and right-wing regimes, political groups and governments are increasingly turning on and scapegoating oppressed people in their societies. Muslims, refugees and migrants. We had a horrible case here just this last week of 27 people dying, migrants and refugees trying to cross the English Channel. Shocking and horrible. Women, LGBT plus people and Roma are all targets. The right want to roll back the gains that oppressed people and the working class have won in recent decades. Trans rights is seen by them consciously as a wedge issue, providing opportunities to split liberals and feminists and make it easier to push attacks on women's and LGBT people's rights in general. Mythical notions like gender ideology and transgender ideology are identified as the hallmarks of the cultural enemy, along with cultural Marxism, in order to attack the left, multiculturalism, abortion rights, refugees and asylum seekers, as well as their new bugbear, wokeism. They claim to be defending freedom of speech against a culture of silencing. But in fact, what they want is freedom of speech for racists and transphobes and those with power and platforms, while cracking down on those who argue back or protest on the streets. The far right swim in this political sewer that now includes anti-vax conspiracy theorists, QAnon adherents, and others influenced by anti-Scientism, promoting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about wealthy Jews funding the so-called trans lobby and what they call transgenderism, that is apparently all about undermining good order, religion, and civilization as we know it. Think about what Trump did when in office and how his Republican supporters continue to attack trans rights in dozens of US states. or Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Putin in Russia, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, who removed trans people's right to change their gender marker on official documents, or the right-wing Polish government promoting LGBT-free zones. Think also of regimes in various African and Southeast Asian countries who weaponize a kind of faux anti-colonialism against trans and LGBT rights, claiming that homosexuality and gender non-conformity didn't exist before colonialism, and that calling for LGBT plus rights now constitutes a form of neo-colonialism. Think, of course, of what's been going on here in Britain as well. In September 2021, the EU's Economic Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination reported on the European situation, saying that, and I'm quoting here, the significant advances achieved in recent years are now under threat. And in the case of the UK, again a quote, anti-trans rhetoric, arguing that sex is immutable and gender identity is not valid, has also been gaining baseless and concerning credibility at the expense of both trans people's civil liberties and women's and children's rights. The UK has been a particular focus for anti-trans agitation and the promotion of attempts to remove trans people's access to single-sex spaces that we've been using for decades. A range of organisations want to undermine the protections in the Gender Recognition Act, which was passed in 2004, and the 2010 Equality Act. Among some trans people, the UK has become labelled Turf Island due to the scale of attacks on trans rights here. These emerged after 2016, when a parliamentary committee recommended changes to the 2004 Gender Recognition Act that would introduce self-identification to get a gender recognition certificate instead of the currently lengthy and medicalised process. A gender recognition certificate allows a person to change their gender marker on their birth certificate and confers legal protection against being outed. In recent years, the hostility in the mainstream media and on social media here has escalated. One of the latest issues has been the student protests at Sussex University against Kathleen Stock, author of the gender critical book Material Girls, which resulted in her resignation. And she then promptly took an appointment at the new anti-woke University of Austin in Texas after she toured all the media outlets here in Britain to complain of being silenced. There have also been attacks on the main LGBT advocacy organisation here, Stonewall, and the trans young people's charity Mermaids, trying to defund and delegitimate them. The press is often hostile, including the BBC, who carried a highly transphobic article a couple of weeks ago claiming that trans women are pressuring lesbians into sex. These arguments obviously carry over into education, into politics, into healthcare, and obviously also into social work practice and training. In August 2021, Social Work England called for further discussion of social workers' use of social media after warning a practitioner over a series of Facebook posts that were discriminatory towards trans people. In 2018, a government-funded study of social work training in the UK had found that while there were pockets of good practice, training was, and I quote, largely deficient on transgender issues. Interviews conducted with stakeholders found that many trans people have poor experience with services. Clearly, there's much to think about and do to make social work training and practice genuinely and comprehensively anti-oppressive towards trans and gender non-conforming people. A good deal of effort needs to be put into raising awareness of trans lives and aspirations generally, and making serious efforts to listen to trans and gender non-conforming voices. In this way, more trans people can be encouraged to take up social work training and feel supported and safe in doing so. And fewer stakeholders and service users will be turned off from accessing the services they need. So to conclude, much can and should be done within social work to address transphobia in society. But ultimately, I think we need to change the very nature of the societies that we live in. In my book, which you can see behind me, the cover of it, I argue that trans liberation is not possible in capitalism, as like other oppressions. It's endemic to the social relations of the system of production and reproduction itself. That, of course, is not an argument for not tackling the issue within the profession here and now. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that very powerful contribution. And just to say, this webinar this afternoon will be a safe space both for trans people and for people supporting trans rights. So any reactionary transphobes will be immediately removed from the webinar. Thank you. Okay, after that contribution by Laura, I'm delighted to introduce our second speaker. Jessica Kant is a member of the Boston Liberation Health Group. The Boston Liberation Health Group is one of the most active and exciting sections of SWAN International, developing really progressive, holistic social work in the US. Jessica is also a licensed independent clinical social worker and a part-time lecturer at Boston University School of Social Work. As a psychotherapist, she provides individual and family therapy to LGBTQ+ youth and their families through the lens of liberation frameworks. Jessica also works as a lead analyst on the transgender family election study at Boston Children's Hospital, looking at the impact of anti-trans rhetoric on trans youth and their families. So I'm really delighted to hand over to Jessica.
Thanks so much, Ian. So I'm going to share my screen for a minute. And just let me know. Oh, let me know. Can you see the slides in front of you? Great. I have to say, I've been teaching for 6 years. Oddly, no one has heckled me until I transitioned, and I'm sure that's purely an accident. That's not true. I had a student heckle me. So because brevity is not my strong suit, I want to encourage you to go to, here's a link tree of resources. And there are going to be a couple other talks, particularly aimed at social workers working with youth. If you scroll down, that I've given in other places. Ooh. So there's so much to talk about that I'm going to concentrate on the attacks on trans youth. Mostly because I work primarily with children and families, and because I think it's something that's different about the attacks on trans people in the past 4 or 5 years than maybe 10 years ago, when maybe reactionaries were hesitant to talk about trans youth or acknowledge their existence. So this means that the policy battleground has moved from something like executive orders, where you have a single figurehead in the states who makes a proclamation, in previous case, banning trans people from military service or banning us from homeless shelters, things like that, and instead doing state legislation. Every state, for those of you not in the United States, has wildly different laws. And so one of the ways that conservatives and reactionaries push through regressive policies is to target places where more progressive thought is less. Just try to switch on the wrong computer. So let's talk about a historical moment for a little bit. As you can see, I'm going to be focusing an awful lot on the attack on puberty blockers, which are a type of medication that are good to some trans youth who want to delay puberty. So in the United States in 2020, 19 bills were proposed, and those all aimed to prohibit gender-affirming care. Those efforts expanded, and now in 2021, 35 bills have been introduced in 22 states, and all of them have the same aim. This is just speaking about trans healthcare for kids. Actually, according to the Human Rights Campaign, 250 anti-LGBTQ bills have been introduced just in state legislatures, which does not include things at the federal level. At the bottom, You can just see sort of, this is my attempt at a time lapse. It's not complete. I'll be posting a more complete version of this. But you can see in 2018, there were a couple of attempts to ban healthcare for trans youth. You see it grows in 2019. It starts to explode in 2020, and it starts to take over the map in 2021. And the reality is that if this were a map of anti-trans laws, just in general targeting us, it would be red completely. It would start with sort of, it would be pink starting in 2018 and completely dark red by the end. Bills in various states that have been proposed have been banning trans youth participation in sports, banning the affirmation of trans children at schools. So declaring that teachers and social workers and youth workers cannot use children's actual name or pronouns, and needing to dead name them. Even more egregiously, some of the policies or some of the legislation has actually required teachers and social workers to out transgender youth, calling their parents, and in a couple of cases, or at least one in particular, a youth was outed and 3 days later murdered by their father for coming out as trans. The reason they hadn't come out yet is because they were afraid something like that would happen. Most commonly, you see the banning public bathroom use by trans people. In May of 2021, I lost the ability to use the bathroom in Tennessee. Thankfully, the federal judge has blocked that. But at the time, the law would have required this biohazard looking sign that warned people of the presence of trans people that would have been legally required by businesses in the state. Other bills have blocked the legal right to change one's name or gender marker. And then most prolifically banning gender affirming care, such as hormones or puberty blockers, and often with extremely misleading statements about what is actually offered to children. I don't have time to talk about ROGD itself. I imagine that fans of this concept are the ones who were very much in our chat earlier. But the primary shift from targeting trans adults to targeting children was made possible by what was pseudoscience that was actually cooked up originally by a social worker. She was a self-described Jungian psychoanalyst. Her name is Lisa Marciano, and she proposed that the explanation for more and more trans youth couldn't be that youth are feeling more accepted, couldn't have been progress in society. It had to be a psychic epidemic. And she was drawing all the way back from Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. So this was not based in epidemiology, no matter how much you dressed it up as that. For more, just for the sake of time, I will say I will please encourage you to check out Florence Perret's article on this, also known as Florence Ashley. They've written an exceptional sort of play-by-play of how ROGD took off and how it became sort of the groundswell for policy. But the one thing that I have to say is that a book came out a few years ago and was heavily platformed by everywhere in the United States. The book was called Irreversible Damage. It was written by a former attorney named Abigail Schreier. She's a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. And Irreversible Damage's full title is The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. And it was based on interviews with non-affirming trans parents, or non-affirming parents of trans youth, trying to prove that there was this social contagion. Well, who funded Abigail Schreier? Well, it was the anti-abortion movement. Seeing that the attack of telling us that we're going to hell was no longer in fashion, although certainly that happened earlier, this far-right partnership formed where they created this pseudoscience targeted doctors and social workers and teachers and nurses and anybody who affirmed trans youth, and created it as both a public media campaign and then built legislation to attack us from a state level. One of the scariest things about these and thinking about social workers and our role in this is that, in bills that were proposed in Texas and Arkansas actually tried to redefine child abuse in those states. So, you know, if you've seen US law, it's extremely extremely long and cumbersome. And they added paragraphs that would seek affirming trans youth to codify that as child abuse. Well, for those of you familiar with the US social work system, who actually does child protection here? It's social workers. Amazingly, despite the fact that what would be required by these bills grossly unethical, our organization like NASW, the National Association of Social Workers, has said essentially nothing and has been, I'm going to say, spineless on this issue, which is part of why I'm so happy when Swan reached out and asked me to speak this morning. A couple of things that US social workers are going to have to be prepared to do. We are, given the way that these laws are built and these policies, is we're going to have to think about non-cooperation. It is not possible to fulfill your responsibilities and your ethical requirements as a social worker and out trans children or detonate them in front of their peers. It is not possible to ostracize people in a way that is supportive. And so if that is happening, we need to refuse. And we're going to need labor unions. In particular, teachers unions in the United States are extremely strong, possibly our only strong unions. And we will need to partner with labor unions, particularly educational unions, to protect workers who refuse things like forced disclosures and outing. And we're going to need to set up legal defense funds. Can I have a quick time check? Okay, I'm just going to keep talking then. So social workers who aren't in target state, something that I think is going to be important. Consider seeking reciprocity licensure. Dora, were you going to give me that time check? Okay. Social workers should be looking at getting licensed across the United States. And this is going to be so that we can provide care to youth in places where regressive policies have effectively destroyed services aimed at youth. Finally, there's something called the Gallup Pledge. The Gallup Pledge is a way of connecting providers, particularly cisgender providers, with transgender service users who are trying to access, in particular, medical care, but need letters of recommendation from what we call behavioral health providers in the United States. So psychiatrists, therapists, social workers, etc. And the Gallup Pledge, people pledge that they will donate their time to help make that possible to get over insurance requirements. All right, it's going to be really important to establish community advisory boards. One of the things that's been really great, and for those who don't know, those are where you bring service users or clients, depending on your regional language, to advise you on your policies, and particularly people who have used your services, and create a feedback loop where it is possible for people to say, this worked well, this absolutely did not work well. Because when you're implementing programs, you're going to miss something. The other thing that I think is really important, is a great sort of development that's happened, has been the move from the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, which has been largely an apolitical body, to an all trans-led, essentially a caucus that stands in opposition to WPATH called TPATH. They held their first conference, and this was over the summer, and it was led by Avery Everhart, a trans health researcher, and Noah Adams, who is a doctoral candidate at the University of Toronto and a social worker himself. Sessions were led on fighting oppressive practices, creating trans-led services, and tackling white supremacy. I'm going to pause for there, just so that we can have more time for everyone else, and then all of these slides will be available publicly.
Thank you very much, Jess. Thank you very much for this presentation. You said some very important things. You said social work as gender police, pushing for change in difficult times, and refuse politics that contradict human rights guidelines as set from the National Federation of Social Work. So these are very important guidelines for social workers across the world. And that's why it's very important to speak out and say it clearly and say it loud. Trans rights are human rights, and we need to show our solidarity. Okay, thank you very much. And now we'll move to our next speaker, who is Mariella Carla Morandi. Mariella is a social worker, has a master in political science and sociology, currently pursuing a PhD in political science. She's a social worker of the Direction of Sexual Diversity of Rosario in Argentina, and a professor at the School of Social Work of National University of Rosario. So Mariella, it's wonderful having you here. Please unmute yourself. You just, good, great.
Now, okay. Excuse me. Thanks for the invitation to the webinar. I would like to share screen. Can I share screen?
We can hear you.
We can hear you, Mariella.
We can hear you.
Can I
Please
share?
continue.
Well, maybe I can't share screen with.
You cannot share the screen?
No.
It's okay, no problem, no problem. Here it is. So it's okay. Thank you.
Now, okay. Well, my name is Mariela Morandi. I live in Rosario, Argentina. I am a cisgender woman, and I consider as a member of an LGBTI plus population. Well, first of all, I'd like to begin by briefly mentioning a few points that describe the regional situation in Latin America regarding trans people. My intention is not to victimize trans population, which in this region is gaining power and visibility in the last 12 years with other sexual dissident movements, but to point out real and grave problems that actually exist in this part of the world. According to Red Flag Trans, a non-profit organization that has been fighting discrimination against trans people since 2004, approximately 77% of trans people are expelled from their homes during childhood. One in 4 trans people do not finish high school because of the intense harassment they receive from teachers and classmates. 52% suffer discrimination in health centers and hospitals. In effect, violence against the trans community shapes a Latin America marked by a myriad of unsolved hate crimes, endemic and exclusionary discrimination, the neglect of justice, and sex work as a way of life. According to a report by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the life expectancy of trans women in Latin America is only 35 years old. Violence, poverty, and exclusion especially expose trans people due to gender inequality, while other power relations alarmingly reduce the average life expectancy of trans women to 35 years, as the 2018 report highlights. Considering the legal advances in Latin America, we can see that there are only 4 countries with federal law: Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Bolivia. and other nations such as Costa Rica, Ecuador, Colombia, and Mexico that allow changing the name according to gender identity without undergoing a previous intervention on the body. Considering the legal advances in Argentina in particular, we identify a dual situation. At the legal level, an accelerated process for the recognition of women and sexual disidency rights took place in the last 12 years. It was driven by social organizations and feminists and made possible by left-wing political administrations. Emblematic laws were passed that mobilized issues and debates that were not socially installed in society, such as the equal marriage law and the gender identity law. These laws were fundamental milestones to bring forward this discussion and to establish a base for sexual disidency rights. In addition, other significant laws was passed in 2021, the trans labor quota law and the non-binary national identity card that was a decree that modified the gender identity law. In spite of this auspicious lengthening in the legal field, there are still acute problems and barriers in daily life of trans populations which complicate their chances of survival and of living a dignified life. According to a report on the human rights situation of transvestites and trans in Argentina, produced by trans organizations such as ACAJATA, O-Trans, and Personas Trans Autoconvocadas de Argentina, in 2016, the trans population is structurally poor because they are systematically excluded from formal education systems, which exclude them from formal and informal labor markets. As a direct consequence, 90% of trans women succeed in Argentina as sex workers. These women are predominantly men exposed to male violence, which often takes the form of police violence. They are subject to three dimensions of oppression due to their condition as women, sex workers, and trans. Trans activists themselves, such as Marcela Romero, María Belén Correa, or Nadir Cardoso, in a conversation called Argentina, Let's Go for the Maximum Integral Trans Law, confirmed this situation, pointing out the particular difficulties that persist in their daily life, deepened by the isolation and prevention measures against corona. These activists point out central problems for Latin America and the region that have been aggravated during the pandemic, many of those we can see in the slide. As a result, in 2021, the main slogan at the LGBTI+ Pride March that took place this November in the main cities of the country was Integral Trans Law Now. A slogan that highlights the conviction of the trans population regarding the value of the Argentinian gender identity law, a document that establishes an essential legal foundation for trans people, but is insufficient to guarantee the real exercise of the right. Therefore, another law is needed to detail and specify rights in certain fundamental areas of the development of people's daily life, such as health, education, work. And there is still much to be done in the construction of social policies and institutions that allow the realization of these rights. The Integral Trans Law project has antecedents in the Uruguayan experience of Integral Trans Law, approved on October 2018. In Argentina, there are already some projects presented, the result of the work of organizations such as ATA, Casa Trans, or the Argentine Federation of LGBT. This law seeks to legislate on central aspects for the achievement in different social spheres of a baseline of equality and social, economic, labor, cultural inclusion, and a real access to the educational and health system. Its general principles are respect and inherent dignity and personal autonomy, including the freedom to decide about one's own body and life project. That is to say, this is a law that seeks to punctuate very generalized aspects of the gender identity law, complementing it to advancing concrete policies and a concrete budget based on a diagnosis. In this sense, the national government treated in recent years the Ministry of Women, Gender and Diversity, an organization that has recently published, among other materials, a guide of rights for trans people, with advances in public policies and legislation oriented to the population of trans people's rights. Even though these constitute concrete policies already in place for the exercise of rights, the possibilities of access to them vary considerably among the different regions of this country. So, how does this state of affairs, this reality of transgender people challenge us, professionals of social work in Argentina? As we know, social work is a profession committed to human rights, as stated in our federal law of social work. Discussing with colleagues such as Claudio Barbero, Maria Eugenia Hermida, we were convinced that social work is not limited to the normative compliance with citing protocols and laws, but consists of an approach that entails a guaranteeing look at the access to those rights, revealing the active presence of the state in public policies of assistance, preparation, promotion, and guarantee of human, social, and popular rights. However, sometimes occurs that our practices become oppressive when they are focused on control issues that seek to justify bureaucratic goals rather than enhance human welfare. From this perspective, and as the implicit title of this discussion, it is worth asking ourselves, in what kind of actions and intervention processes are we being professionals that reproduce oppression towards the trans population? How many times do we focus on the justification of the bureaucratic mechanisms of which we are part as state agents? And therefore, what case can we contribute to realize an anti-oppressive social work that respects the rights of trans people? Today, I want to share a few points to contribute to think this question. First of all, to maintain a careful epistemological surveillance regarding the prejudices that are tied to our views about the subject and their demands, which implies labeling and just not allowing us to sustain the always new question about who is the other and what is the demand at a given time and place. B. Propose training instances that aim to problematize, question these stereotypes about LGBTI+, as well as gender expressions and values in different groups and institutions of society, such as businessmen, professionals, state agents. C. To strengthen the work of sexual dissidence organizations in advising trans people from vulnerable sectors about their rights, the existing institutions and the channels for the exercise of these rights, because to expand this information is to expand the possibilities of exercising rights. D. To denounce the binary and cisgender criteria present in forms, posters, flyers, providing theoretical and practical tools for its formulation in a broad view of gender identity, sexuality, and values. To influence in the removal of all kinds of institutional obstacles that impede the access of trans people in spaces that still explicitly or implicitly resist their presence, discussing criteria and accompanying people, avoiding their exposure to new exclusions. To assist trans people in situations of undermining of basic rights, such as housing, education, or economic subsistence, denounces the almost always insufficient and punctual solutions offered in the framework of state public policy. To promote instances of labor access, questioning stereotypes with businessmen and other employers accompanying sexual dissidence organizations in the request for quota. This was done here in Rosario with the trans labor quota for municipal offices, and in the National University of Rosario. 8. As part of the state, financially and institutionally support the initiatives of LGBTI+ organizations in relation to commemorative and recreational events, demos, and so on. To make visible in decision-making and management instances the still veiled violence to which trans people are exposed on a daily basis. For example, those related to sex worker conditions, making known aspects that are still not sufficiently recognized, nor are they willing to talk about. Consider the itinerary, timetables, and spaces that trans go through in their daily life in the design of public policies. Those are often designed for a majority, ignoring the conditions of specific populations, being necessary to make this gap visible. Also, to make visible the presence of trans children, seeking to point out stereotypes in the institutions such as schools, clubs, health centers, offering spaces of social support to the families in order to clear up questions respecting the times of each process of identity construction. In
2
situations
minutes,
related-
Magda.
Okay,
Does- does-
I am finishing. To sum up, we propose an anti-oppressive social work that is conscious and respectful of the subject with whom we work, in permanent revision of its underlying assumptions. Also, we propose to influence the design of social policies that tend to make possible the exercise of rights in the different fields about mentioned, health, education, etc. This design should be in dialogue, negotiation, and articulation with sexual dissident organizations, which are the ones who understand the facts on the ground. I believe that social work can have an special impact on the deepening of an anti-oppressive approach that modifies how we see and conceive trans people as subjects of rights. The diffusion of this view and the reworking in the different social environments is a powerful contribution that our profession can make, demanding the fulfillment of the already existing laws, as well as accompanying the new trans demands that are emerging in order to translate it into laws and concrete devices that facilitate and promote the real exercise of rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariela. Thank you. Thank you very much for your contribution. So we are now ready to go for questions or comments, or whoever wants to have a comment or a question, please raise your hand.